The courtroom was silent. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the judge's final decision on the case. But suddenly, in the middle of the tense atmosphere, Judge Clark's eyes widened in shock. He dropped the papers he was holding onto the desk, his hand trembling. The room gasped, but the judge didn't seem to notice. His face had turned pale, and his voice, usually calm and firm, now wavered. "Wait a minute. Is that you, Kyle?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The defendant, Kyle Harris, who had been sitting quietly in the witness chair, looked up in surprise. His eyes met the judge's, and for a moment, there was a strange, heavy pause. Then, with a slow shake of his head, Kyle responded, "Judge Clark? No way. I didn't expect this. You're the last person I thought I'd see on the other side of the bench." The entire courtroom fell silent. Everyone was staring at the two men, the air thick with confusion. Judge Clark blinked a few times, his face now a mix of recognition and disbelief. "Your Honor, do you know this man?" a lawyer from the prosecution asked, a hint of disbelief in his voice. Judge Clark didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at Kyle, his expression softening as memories seemed to flood back. His hand went to his chin, as if trying to process the impossible. I know him," Judge Clark finally said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "He was my best friend when we were kids." The room erupted in whispers. The defense attorney stood up, shocked. "Your Honor, are you telling me you've known the defendant for years?" Judge Clark didn't respond right away. He was still staring at Kyle, his mind racing. This wasn't just any trial. This wasn't just another case of a criminal being judged. Kyle, who had grown up in the same neighborhood as Judge Clark, had been accused of a serious crime. Yet, it wasn't just his past friendship with Kyle that made this situation so complicated. It was the memories, the good memories, of growing up together, playing in the same street, sharing dreams of the future, and laughing about everything. They had been inseparable, best friends in a world where they had nothing but each other. But life hadn't been kind to Kyle. Somewhere along the way, things had gone wrong. Kyle had ended up on the wrong path, a path that led him into this very courtroom, sitting in front of the man he once called his best friend. The air grew heavy with tension. What would Judge Clark do now? How could he continue the trial knowing the man in front of him had once been the closest person to him in the world? The courtroom was waiting for an answer, and that answer would change everything. Years ago, in the small town of Springfield, Judge Clark and Kyle were inseparable. They had grown up together, played together, and even promised each other that no matter what happened in life, they would always be there for each other. But life, as it tends to do, had a different plan. Kyle had gotten mixed up with the wrong crowd. He had been caught up in petty crimes, and eventually, those crimes had escalated into something far more dangerous. Kyle's fall from grace had been gradual. At first, it was small things: shoplifting, sneaking into places they shouldn't be, getting caught by the local police a few times. But soon, it became more serious. Kyle found himself in deep with the wrong people, and before long, he was facing charges that seemed impossible to overcome. Meanwhile, Judge Clark had followed a very different path. He had stayed out of trouble, worked hard, and had earned his position as one of the youngest judges in the state. But as successful as he had become, there was always that part of him that missed his old friend, Kyle. He had tried to help Kyle, tried to steer him in the right direction. But no matter how many chances he gave him, Kyle kept slipping further away. It was heartbreaking for Judge Clark. He wanted to help, but Kyle didn't seem to want to help himself. And now, here they were, on opposite sides of the law, with a courtroom full of people waiting for decisions to be made. As the trial continued, Judge Clark struggled with his emotions. He could hardly focus on the case. His thoughts kept drifting back to those carefree days when he and Kyle had shared everything: dreams, fears, and the promise that they would always have each other's backs. But that promise seemed so distant now. Kyle had changed. He was no longer the same boy who had shared his lunch with Clark or laughed until they couldn't breathe. No, now Kyle was accused of a crime so serious that it could change the course of his life forever. The prosecution had presented the evidence. The witnesses had spoken. The case against Kyle seemed rock solid. Yet, despite everything, Judge Clark couldn't bring himself to believe that the person standing before him could be guilty. Not the Kyle he knew, but the law was the law. And as much as he wanted to help his old friend, Judge Clark knew that he had a duty to uphold the law, to seek justice for the victims involved. But how could he be impartial when he had so much history with the man sitting in front of him? The judge's heart was torn. Could he let his childhood friendship cloud his judgment? Could he really send Kyle to prison, knowing everything they had once meant to each other? Or should he find a way to help Kyle, to give him another chance, even if it meant going against everything he stood for as a judge? The question swirled in his mind. And then, just as he was about to make a decision, something unexpected happened. Kyle stood up suddenly, his voice trembling as he addressed the court. "I didn't do it," he shouted, his eyes filled with desperation. "I swear, I didn't do it. I don't know what's going on, but I didn't commit that crime." Judge Clark's heart skipped a beat. Kyle's words were filled with sincerity, but the judge knew better than anyone that criminals sometimes say whatever they think will get them out of trouble. Still, there was something in Kyle's eyes that made Clark hesitate. Something that made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, his old friend was telling the truth. But before he could say anything, the door to the courtroom swung open with a loud bang. A woman entered, her face pale and drawn. She rushed to the front, and in a shaky voice, she said, "Judge Clark, I have new evidence. Evidence that could change everything." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. What was this new evidence? What was going to happen next? And as Judge Clark looked at Kyle, his old friend, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The moment of truth was coming, and it would either make or break their friendship forever. The courtroom was frozen in time. The woman who had just entered, her face a mixture of anxiety and determination, had everyone's attention. Judge Clark stood still, trying to process what had just happened. He had spent the entire trial focused on Kyle, his former best friend, but now, this new person, this new piece of the puzzle, had thrown everything into chaos. The woman stepped forward, a thick file clutched tightly in her hands. "Your Honor," she said, her voice wavering but firm, "I have evidence that proves Kyle didn't commit the crime he's being accused of. This evidence could exonerate him completely." Judge Clark's heart raced. He turned to Kyle, who was looking just as confused as everyone else in the room. "What's going on?" Kyle muttered, his voice barely audible. The tension in the room was suffocating as everyone waited for the woman to explain. She placed the file on the table in front of Judge Clark, her hands shaking slightly. The judge glanced down at the file and then back at the woman. "What is this evidence?" he asked, his voice still calm but with an edge of urgency. The woman hesitated for a moment before speaking. "It's a set of security footage from the night of the crime. The footage shows Kyle was nowhere near the scene of the incident when it happened. In fact, he was with me at a completely different location." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. The prosecution's lawyer stood up immediately, his face a mask of disbelief. "This is outrageous. How can we trust this woman's word? She could be lying to protect him." Judge Clark held up his hand to silence the room. He was still reeling from the revelation. "We'll review the evidence," he said firmly. "But until then, I suggest we continue the proceedings with caution." The woman nodded, her eyes flickering toward Kyle. "I know it's hard to believe, but I promise you, I'm telling the truth." Kyle looked at her, his expression one of confusion mixed with hope. "Who are you?" he asked. "My name is Emma," she replied, her voice softening. "I used to work with you at the diner. I never wanted to get involved in this, but when I saw you on trial, I knew I had to help. You didn't deserve this. Not like this." Kyle's face softened as memories came flooding back. He remembered Emma. She had been a kind woman who always treated him with respect, even when others looked down on him. But he had no idea that she was now the one who was holding the key to his freedom. "I don't know what to say," Kyle muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Judge Clark glanced at the file once more. His mind was spinning. The footage, if it were true, could completely clear Kyle of all charges. But what if it wasn't? What if Emma was lying? Or worse, what if the footage had been tampered with? The judge felt a pit in his stomach. He had to remain impartial, but this was the hardest case of his career. He had known Kyle for so long, and the thought of sending him to prison was unbearable. But at the same time, he couldn't let his personal feelings cloud his judgment. He had a duty to uphold the law. The courtroom waited for Judge Clark to make his decision. He couldn't delay the inevitable much longer. With a deep breath, he spoke. "We will review the footage immediately. But for now, I suggest we take a recess," he said, standing up and signaling for everyone to leave the room. As the room emptied, Kyle stayed behind, his eyes locked on Emma. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You don't know what this means to me." Emma gave him a small smile, but it was clear that she was just as nervous as he was. "I couldn't just let them accuse you of something you didn't do. I know how hard things have been for you, Kyle. You deserve better than this." Judge Clark watched the two of them as they exchanged words, their emotions running high. The weight of the situation was becoming more real with each passing moment. This wasn't just a courtroom drama. This was a man's life hanging in the balance. And it was becoming clear to the judge that this wasn't going to be an easy decision. After the break, everyone returned to the courtroom. The judge had already requested the security footage, and it was now playing on a large screen in front of everyone. The footage showed Kyle in the diner, far away from the scene of the crime. Exactly as Emma had said, there was no way he could have been in two places at once. The room was silent as the footage continued to play. It was clear to everyone that Kyle had been telling the truth. He had an alibi. But just as the footage ended, something unexpected happened. The defense attorney stood up, his face pale. "Your Honor," he said, his voice shaking, "we have just received a new piece of evidence. Something that could change everything." Judge Clark's heart skipped a beat. He had thought the case was over. But now, this new evidence was making him question everything once again. "What is it?" the judge asked, his voice now filled with dread. The defense attorney hesitated before speaking. "It's a confession." From someone else entirely. A heavy silence fell over the room. A confession? Who could possibly be confessing to the crime? And why hadn't they come forward sooner? Kyle's face turned ashen. "What do you mean? Who's confessing?" The defense attorney didn't answer immediately. Instead, he handed the judge another file. With trembling hands, Judge Clark opened it. Inside was a statement, signed by a man named Jason Carter, a name that meant nothing to anyone in the room. But when the judge read the details of the confession, his blood ran cold. Jason Carter claimed he had been the one to commit the crime. He explained how he had framed Kyle, how he had set him up to take the fall for something he never did. And the most chilling part of it all? Jason Carter had been one of Kyle's old friends. The room was in shock. No one knew how to react. It was one twist after another, and none of them seemed to make sense. Judge Clark sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had to make a decision. And whatever decision he made next would affect the lives of not just Kyle, but everyone involved. What would he do? Would he believe the new confession? Or would he stick to the evidence he had already seen? The tension in the room was unbearable. Everything hung in the balance. Judge Clark leaned back in his chair, the weight of the new confession heavy in his hands. His eyes scanned the page, reading the details over and over again. Jason Carter, Kyle's old friend, claimed responsibility for the crime, and he had outlined exactly how he had framed Kyle. The chilling part was that Jason had described Kyle's involvement in the crime with eerie precision, making it seem as if he had known exactly what had happened that night. Kyle stood at the front of the room, his face pale and filled with disbelief. He looked at the judge, his voice shaky. "Judge Clark, I don't know this Jason Carter. I swear, I've never heard of him before today. Why would he confess to something he didn't do?" The judge's hand trembled slightly as he folded the confession letter. The idea that Kyle was innocent, but framed by someone from his past, was almost too much to comprehend. Kyle had already lost so much in life, and now, to find out that his own friend had betrayed him like this, it was a cruel twist of fate. "Your Honor, this new evidence changes everything," the defense attorney said, his voice urgent. "This confession directly contradicts all the charges against my client. We need to take this into consideration before making any decisions." Judge Clark nodded slowly, trying to process everything. His duty as a judge was to serve justice, but now, the truth seemed tangled in a web of lies, confessions, and unexplainable coincidences. His eyes turned to Kyle, who was still standing in front of the court, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. Kyle's face was a mix of confusion, anger, and relief. It was clear that he had no idea who Jason Carter was or why this man would confess to a crime he didn't commit. But the new evidence was undeniable. The footage had cleared Kyle of being at the crime scene, and now, the confession from Jason Carter cast doubt on the entire case. But there was one thing that Judge Clark couldn't ignore. The letter was signed by Jason Carter, but where was Jason now? Why hadn't he appeared in court to testify or explain himself? The situation was becoming more complicated by the minute. Mr. Carter has not been seen since the confession was delivered, the prosecution lawyer said, speaking up for the first time since the new evidence had been presented. We've contacted all of his known associates, but no one seems to know his whereabouts. It's possible he's trying to flee. The judge frowned. The idea of someone confessing to a crime and then vanishing seemed like something out of a crime thriller. But this wasn't a story, it was real life. And real lives were at stake. Your Honor, I request that we issue a warrant for Jason Carter's arrest immediately, the prosecution continued. We need to bring him in for questioning. His confession doesn't mean anything unless he's here to explain it. The judge nodded, his thoughts swirling. We will issue the warrant, he said, his voice firm. But until we locate Mr. Carter, we must proceed with the trial. This new evidence is significant, but we cannot ignore the fact that Kyle has been accused of a crime, and we need to find the truth. Kyle's head snapped up, a mix of hope and frustration on his face. So, what does that mean for me, Judge? Are you going to let me go? Or will I still be stuck here? Judge Clark hesitated before responding. Kyle, I wish I could say that everything is clear now, but it's not. This confession is important, but until we have Jason Carter in court to verify it, I cannot simply dismiss the charges against you. The words stung. Kyle had been through so much already, and now, the idea that he might still have to face a trial despite this new evidence felt like a cruel joke. But Judge Clark knew that he had to follow the law. It wasn't just about his feelings or his past friendship with Kyle. It was about ensuring that justice was served, no matter how difficult it might be. Your Honor, the defense attorney said, breaking the silence. We request that you release Kyle on bail while the authorities continue to search for Jason Carter. He is not a flight risk, and the evidence we have presented shows that he was wrongfully accused. Judge Clark thought for a moment, his gaze shifting from Kyle to the defense attorney, then back to the file in front of him. The request seemed reasonable. The footage, the confession, everything pointed to the fact that Kyle had been wronged. But he couldn't make a decision based solely on his emotions. He had to consider everything. Very well, Judge Clark said, finally making up his mind. I will allow Kyle to be released on bail, pending the further investigation into Jason Carter's confession. But the trial is not over, and we will continue to seek the truth. I will not allow anyone to escape justice. The gavel came down with a sharp thud, signaling the end of the day's proceedings. The courtroom began to empty, but Kyle didn't move immediately. He stood there, still in shock, as the defense attorney walked up to him and gave him a reassuring pat on the back. You're free to go for now, the defense attorney said, but we still have a lot of work to do. We need to find Jason Carter, and we need to make sure that the truth comes out. Everything's going to be okay, Kyle. We're going to clear your name. Kyle nodded, his emotions running wild. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He was free, at least for now. But the road ahead was uncertain, and he had no idea where it would lead. The thought of finding Jason Carter and getting him to come forward was terrifying. What if Jason didn't want to be found? What if he had disappeared forever? As Kyle walked out of the courtroom, his mind was filled with questions. But one thing was certain, everything had just changed, and he wasn't sure whether that was a good thing or not. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, a shadowy figure watched from a distance. His eyes were fixed on Kyle as he left the building, his face hidden beneath a hood. The figure pulled out his phone and sent a single text message. It's time. Move forward with the plan. The text was brief, but its meaning was clear. Kyle wasn't out of danger yet, and as the figure disappeared into the crowd, a sense of dread washed over him. There were more twists to this story. Much more. Would Kyle find out the truth behind Jason Carter's confession? And what exactly was the plan that was about to unfold? The answers would come soon enough. But for now, the questions were too much to bear. Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Even though he was free for now, the shadows that lurked just beyond the courthouse walls weighed heavily on him. As he walked out of the courthouse, his eyes scanned the crowd, but he didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Still, that sense of unease gnawed at him, like something, or someone, was watching him. His defense attorney had already arranged for him to be released on bail, and Kyle was supposed to meet with Emma afterward. She had been the one to provide the crucial footage that proved his innocence, and now, she was offering him a place to stay while everything was sorted out. She seemed to be the only person he could trust right now. "Come on, Kyle," Emma had told him. "Let's get out of here before anyone notices you." But before he could meet her, the message came, one that shook him to his core. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Kyle pulled it out, his fingers trembling as he read the text that flashed on the screen. "It's time. Move forward with the plan." Kyle's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea who the message was from, but something about it felt wrong. It felt like a warning, a signal that things were about to get much worse. He stood there for a moment, frozen. The crowd outside the courthouse continued to bustle around him, but Kyle felt like he was in another world entirely. This message, who had sent it? And why was it talking about a plan? The last thing he needed was more complications. His life had already been turned upside down, and now, it seemed like the storm was only just beginning. Without thinking, he quickly glanced around, searching for anyone who might seem suspicious. There were too many faces, too many people going about their business. It was impossible to tell if someone had been watching him or if he was just imagining things. But the pit in his stomach told him that something was off. He needed to talk to Emma. He couldn't keep all of this to himself. But before he could take another step, a car screeched to a halt beside him, and the door flew open. "Get in," a voice commanded, one that he didn't recognize. Kyle jumped back, his heart racing. The figure in the car was obscured by the shadows, but he could see the outline of a man in the driver's seat. There was something in his voice that made Kyle's blood run cold. "Who are you?" Kyle demanded, his hand instinctively reaching for his phone, ready to call for help. The man didn't answer at first. Instead, he reached over to the passenger seat and grabbed something. A folder, a briefcase, something important. The man held it out to Kyle, and for a moment, their eyes locked. "I'm not going to hurt you," the man said, his tone surprisingly calm. "But you need to get in. Now." Kyle hesitated. Everything in him screamed to run, to get away from this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. But there was something about the man's demeanor that made Kyle think twice. Something that told him this wasn't just some random encounter. "You don't have time to question me, Kyle," the man continued, his voice almost a whisper. "You're in danger. They know who you are. They're watching you." The words sent a chill down Kyle's spine. Who was they? And how did this man know his name? "Get in the car, and I'll explain everything. But if you don't, it'll be too late," the man insisted, his eyes now pleading. Kyle felt his mind racing. He knew he had no choice but to listen. Whatever was going on, it was bigger than anything he had imagined. He could feel the tension building in the air, like a storm ready to break. And he had a feeling that the man in the car wasn't lying. With one last look at the crowded street, Kyle made up his mind. He opened the door and slid into the car. The man quickly shut the door behind him, and the car sped off, taking them down a series of unfamiliar streets. Kyle's heart was pounding in his chest. He was being pulled into something he didn't understand, and the danger felt more real with every passing second. "Who are you?" Kyle demanded again, his voice shaky but firm. The man glanced at him for a brief second before turning his attention back to the road. "My name's Sam," he said, his tone still calm, though his eyes darted around nervously. "And you don't have a lot of time. You need to know something. This trial isn't just about you. It's bigger than that." Kyle's confusion only deepened. "What do you mean it's bigger than me? I don't understand." Sam took a deep breath before responding. "You're not the only one in danger. There are people who want to control the truth. They want to keep it buried. And Kyle, you're caught in the middle of it." Kyle's mind spun as he tried to process the words. It felt like the world he had once known was unraveling before him. He had been accused of a crime he didn't commit, but now, the situation seemed even darker. People were after the truth. They were hiding something. "I don't know what's happening," Kyle said, his voice rising in frustration. "I just want to clear my name. I don't care about all of this other stuff." Sam's expression grew serious. "You should care, Kyle. You don't realize it yet, but the truth is more dangerous than you think. There are forces at play that could destroy everything if you don't figure it out." Jason Carter's confession wasn't just a random twist. It's part of something much bigger. And if you don't uncover the truth now, things will spiral out of control. The car took a sharp turn, and Kyle was thrown back into his seat. His mind was racing. Everything Sam had said was unsettling, but Kyle couldn't deny that something didn't add up. The pieces of the puzzle weren't fitting together. Suddenly, the car slowed, and Sam pulled into an alleyway. He turned off the engine and looked at Kyle, his expression grave. "We have to be careful," Sam warned. "The people who are after you, they'll stop at nothing to make sure the truth never comes out. And if we're not careful, we might not make it out of this alive." Kyle swallowed hard, trying to push past the fear that was rising in his chest. "What do we do now?" Sam reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to Kyle. "You need to read this. It's your next step. And after that, you'll understand why this is so dangerous." Kyle took the envelope, his fingers shaking as he opened it. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper. It was a set of instructions, detailed, precise, and chilling. The message was clear. "Meet at the warehouse on 5th and Pine at midnight. Bring the confession with you. Don't tell anyone. Don't trust anyone." As Kyle finished reading, his mind was racing again. Who had written this? And why had they given him these instructions? "This is just the beginning," Sam said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "You have no idea what you're up against." The car door slammed open, and Sam quickly stepped out, looking over his shoulder. "We have to move now. The clock is ticking, and we don't have much time." Kyle stared at the envelope in his hands, his heart pounding. He had no idea where this new path would lead, but one thing was certain. His life had just taken another, darker turn. Kyle's mind was in chaos. Every word Sam had spoken echoed in his head, and the strange instructions he now held in his hands felt like a noose tightening around his neck. The dark alleyway was eerily quiet, and the streetlights overhead flickered ominously. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, each breath a little heavier than the last. Sam had already disappeared around the corner, leaving Kyle standing alone in the alley. The car engine had cut off, and the quiet was suffocating. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic and the faint rustling of a stray cat somewhere in the shadows. Kyle had no idea what to do. He felt like he was trapped in a web that was slowly closing in on him, and every time he thought he might be getting out, another strand pulled him back in. The envelope still felt heavy in his hand, its contents a cryptic message that only raised more questions. "Meet at the warehouse on 5th and Pine at midnight. Bring the confession with you. Don't tell anyone. Don't trust anyone." Who had written this? And why had they chosen him? The confession that had cleared him. Was it part of this larger plan? And who was this someone he was supposed to meet? As if on cue, his phone buzzed again. Kyle's stomach churned. He had been trying to avoid looking at it, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that whatever was coming next, it was about to hit him hard. He took a deep breath and unlocked his phone. The message was from an unknown number. "You're not safe. Don't go to the warehouse. Trust no one. They're watching you." Kyle's heart raced as he read the message. Who was this? Was it from someone trying to warn him? Or was it another trap to keep him from going to the warehouse? Everything was starting to feel like a maze with no clear exit. The question gnawed at him. Should I go to the warehouse? He stood frozen for a moment, his mind torn between the cryptic instructions from Sam and the warning from this mysterious sender. Both had said to trust no one, but one was offering him answers, while the other was begging him to avoid danger. "I can't just ignore this," Kyle whispered to himself, his voice shaking slightly. Without wasting another second, Kyle made his decision. He wasn't going to stay in the dark. He needed answers. The only way to get them was to go to 5th and Pine, even if it meant stepping right into the heart of whatever conspiracy was unfolding around him. He glanced around one last time to make sure no one was watching and quickly began walking down the alleyway. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn back, but something deeper pushed him forward. It wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about finding the truth, no matter what it cost. The clock on the wall of the diner read 11:45 p.m. Kyle had told Emma he would meet her at the diner after he had been released, but that was hours ago. He hadn't even contacted her since receiving the mysterious text. It felt wrong to leave her out of it, but he couldn't explain everything right now. He couldn't risk bringing anyone else into this mess. The streets were deserted, the usual hum of traffic gone, leaving only the occasional echo of footsteps behind him. As he approached 5th and Pine, Kyle's heart pounded in his chest. The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking silhouette against the dark sky, its windows broken and covered in grime. The place looked abandoned, neglected, as if it had been forgotten by time itself. He stepped onto the cracked sidewalk, his footsteps the only sound in the stillness of the night. Kyle's mind raced with questions, but every step brought him closer to answers. He had to find out who was behind this, who was trying to set him up and why, and perhaps more importantly, who was trying to help him and who was working against him. Kyle reached the entrance to the warehouse, its metal door hanging loosely on one hinge. He paused before stepping inside, his breath shallow and uneven. The world seemed to hold its breath along with him. He could feel the weight of everything pressing in. Then, from the shadows, a voice called out to him. "Kyle," it said, low and smooth, "you came. I didn't think you would." Kyle froze, his instincts kicking into high gear. He whipped around, scanning the darkness. The voice had come from behind him, but there was no one there. "Who's there?" Kyle called out, his voice sharp, demanding an answer. A figure stepped into the dim light, a woman dressed in black. Her face was obscured by a hood, but her eyes gleamed with an unsettling intensity. She was holding something in her hands, a briefcase. Kyle took a cautious step back, his heart racing. This wasn't Sam, and this wasn't anyone he recognized. "Who are you?" Kyle asked again, his voice a little weaker this time. The woman smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. "I'm the one you've been waiting for," she said, her voice calm, yet heavy with a sense of finality. Kyle's mind raced as he tried to process her words. "I don't understand," he muttered. "Who are you?" "You'll understand soon enough," the woman replied, her smile never leaving her face. "But right now, you need to know something." She opened the briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers, handing them to Kyle. "These are the answers you've been looking for. But be careful, Kyle. What you're about to learn is going to change everything. Trust no one, not even Sam." Kyle looked down at the papers, but before he could ask another question, a loud crash rang out from behind him, a sudden explosion of noise that sent a shockwave through the warehouse. Kyle spun around, his body tensing. The woman in front of him disappeared into the shadows, leaving him with the papers in his hands, unsure of what was real and what was a trap. Suddenly, he heard footsteps, fast, hurried, and then the distinct sound of a gun being cocked. "Drop the papers," a voice shouted. "Now." Kyle's pulse spiked as he turned, his instincts telling him to run, to escape whatever was coming next. But the figure who had spoken was already moving toward him, a shadowy figure stepping from the dark. Kyle's mind raced. Who were they? Why were they here? What did they want? And as the barrel of the gun gleamed under the flickering lights, Kyle realized that this moment was only the beginning of something much, much bigger than he had ever imagined. The truth was getting closer, but so was the danger. The cold metal barrel of the gun glinted in the dim light, and Kyle's heart hammered against his chest. His body froze, the weight of the situation sinking in. The voice that had commanded him to drop the papers was cold, filled with authority, and left no room for hesitation. "Drop the papers now," the voice repeated, more forceful this time. Kyle's mind raced. The briefcase, the papers, the warning from the mysterious text. Everything was spiraling out of control faster than he could process. He glanced down at the stack of papers in his hand. What was inside them? Was it the key to everything? To proving his innocence? Or had he just walked straight into another trap? His instinct screamed at him to run, but the gun pointed in his direction made that impossible. He had to act fast, but not without thinking. This wasn't just a robbery. No, this was something far more dangerous. Whoever these people were, they weren't just after money. They were after something much bigger, and Kyle had no idea if he was just a pawn in their game, or if he could find a way to fight back. "Who are you?" Kyle asked, his voice shaky but determined, trying to buy himself some time. He couldn't just hand over the papers without understanding what was happening. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, the gun remained aimed at him, unwavering. Slowly, a shadowed figure stepped forward into the weak light. It was a man, tall and imposing, his face concealed by a mask. His eyes were cold, calculating. "Don't play games," the masked man said, his voice low and gravelly. "You don't get to ask questions. You just do as you're told." Kyle's hands trembled slightly, but he didn't let go of the papers. "I won't just hand them over to you," he said, his voice gaining strength despite the fear building inside him. The masked man's grip on the gun tightened, and his eyes narrowed. "You think you have a choice? You're in no position to negotiate, Kyle. Drop the papers now." Kyle's mind raced as the man in front of him slowly closed the distance, the barrel of the gun never wavering. He couldn't let this happen. He had to keep the papers, no matter the cost. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fall into place, but there was still so much to uncover. What if this was his one chance to get to the truth? Without thinking, Kyle made his move. He darted sideways, attempting to get behind a nearby pillar. But just as his foot hit the ground, there was a sharp crack, and the sound of a bullet whizzed past his ear, so close that it made his skin prickle. He froze, his pulse racing. He had narrowly avoided being shot. The man didn't speak now, but the tension in the air was thick. Kyle could hear his own breathing, harsh and erratic, as his heart pounded in his chest. He was cornered, and the masked man was closing in. "You're not getting away," the masked man said, his voice chilling. "The papers belong to us. And if you think you're the hero in this story, you're sadly mistaken." Kyle's mind was in overdrive. He had no idea who these people were, but it was clear now that they were willing to do anything to get what they wanted. They had no mercy, no hesitation. He was just a pawn in their game, and he had to find a way to escape. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine revving broke through the tension. Tires screeched on the pavement, growing louder with each passing second. Kyle's eyes snapped to the entrance of the warehouse, where headlights suddenly blazed through the darkness. It was a distraction, a chance he couldn't afford to miss. Without wasting a second, Kyle bolted, running as fast as he could toward the door. The masked man shouted after him, but Kyle didn't look back. He didn't need to. His feet carried him out into the night, the cold air biting at his skin as he sprinted down the alleyway. He could hear footsteps behind him, but he didn't dare slow down. He had to lose them. He had to get away. The truth was within his grasp, but it was slipping through his fingers as the danger closed in on him. As he rounded the corner, the screeching of tires grew louder, and suddenly, a car swerved into the alley, blocking his path. The engine roared as the car came to a halt just inches from him. The door of the car flew open, and a figure emerged from inside. But it wasn't the masked man. It was Sam. Kyle's heart skipped a beat when he saw him, but his relief was short-lived. Sam's expression was grim, his face hard as he grabbed Kyle by the arm. "Get in the car," Sam shouted, urgency in his voice. Kyle hesitated, his mind still reeling from the close call. "What's going on, Sam?" he asked, his voice hoarse with fear and frustration. "Who are they? What do they want?" Sam didn't answer right away. Instead, he pushed Kyle toward the car, glancing behind them as if expecting the masked men to show up at any moment. "We don't have time for questions. Just get in. Now." Kyle's brain was firing with questions, but he had no choice. He didn't know who to trust anymore, but Sam was the only one who had offered him help up until this point. For now, he had to trust him. He jumped into the car, and before he could even close the door, Sam slammed the pedal to the metal, sending the car racing down the street. Kyle could see the masked men running after them in the rearview mirror, but the car quickly gained speed, leaving them behind. As they sped through the streets, Kyle turned to Sam. What's going on? Who are those people? Sam kept his eyes on the road, his jaw clenched tightly. You're in deeper than you realize, Kyle. Those people, those masked men, they're part of something much bigger. And right now you're a target. But I'm not going to let them get to you. Kyle's mind was spinning. What do you mean? What's this all about? Sam's eyes flickered toward him, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small device, pressing a button on it. A series of numbers flashed across a screen in the car, and Sam's face grew even more serious. They know where we are, he muttered under his breath, his grip tightening on the wheel. We've got to get off the grid. Now. Kyle's heart skipped a beat. Who knows where we are? He asked, his voice trembling. Who's chasing us? Sam didn't answer. He just pressed the accelerator harder, taking a sharp turn onto a side street. Kyle had no idea what was happening anymore, but he knew one thing for sure. His life was no longer his own. It had been taken over by forces he didn't understand, and the truth he was so desperate to uncover was more dangerous than he ever could have imagined. The ride was silent, the tension thick between them, as the city lights blurred past. There was no turning back now. They were on the run, and the truth was waiting for him somewhere, hidden in the shadows, just beyond his reach. But the closer he got to it, the more dangerous everything seemed. And Kyle had no idea how far this would go. The car sped through the winding streets, leaving behind the faint echo of screeching tires. Kyle sat in the passenger seat, eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, half expecting the masked men to show up at any moment. His heart was still racing, his mind unable to fully process everything that had just happened. The warehouse, the explosion of sound, the masked man with the gun. It all felt like a nightmare, one that he couldn't wake up from. Sam didn't speak. He focused solely on the road, his hands gripping the wheel with an intensity that matched the urgency in the air. Every turn they made seemed calculated, precise, as though he was trying to shake off any pursuers who might be following them. Kyle watched the street signs fly by, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading further into uncharted territory. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sam broke the silence. We're not safe yet, he muttered, his voice low and tense. Kyle didn't reply. He didn't know what to say. Sam had been the one to help him get out of that mess, but there were still so many questions swirling in his mind. Why had Sam shown up when he did? And why hadn't he told Kyle what was really going on? Where are we going? Kyle asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though the tremor in it betrayed his fear. We need to get to a safe house, Sam said, glancing at Kyle for a split second before turning his attention back to the road. Somewhere off the radar. Away from all of this. Safe house, Kyle repeated, raising an eyebrow. Who's chasing us, Sam? Who are those people? What do they want? Sam's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer right away. They drove in silence for a few more minutes, the hum of the engine the only sound in the car. Kyle's mind raced as he tried to piece together the puzzle. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger, and he was stuck in the middle of it. Eventually, Sam sighed. Those people you encountered, they're part of a group that wants to control everything. They want power. And right now, they think you're a threat. A threat? Kyle repeated, his confusion growing. I'm just trying to clear my name, Sam. I don't know what's going on. Why would they be after me? Because of what you have, Sam said, his voice quiet but urgent. The confession. It's not just any confession. It's tied to something much bigger. A conspiracy that goes deeper than you realize. Kyle's blood ran cold. A conspiracy? Sam nodded. Yes. A conspiracy involving some of the highest people in the city. People who will stop at nothing to keep the truth buried. And you have the key. The papers you're holding, they're the proof. The evidence that could bring everything crashing down. The words hit Kyle like a ton of bricks. He had known there was something off about the whole situation, but hearing Sam lay it out so plainly was another level of terrifying. If what Sam was saying was true, Kyle wasn't just a man wrongly accused of a crime. He was a target in a war between powerful people, and the only thing standing in their way was him. So, those people, those masked men, are trying to stop me from revealing the truth? Kyle asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sam nodded grimly. Exactly. They've already tried to kill you once tonight. They won't hesitate to do it again. And they'll keep coming until they get what they want. Kyle's hands clenched into fists. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. How had his life gone from a simple, clear-cut case of injustice to something so convoluted and dangerous? How had he become a part of something so much bigger than himself? I didn't sign up for any of this, Kyle muttered, his voice filled with frustration and fear. All I want is to clear my name. Sam glanced at him, his expression softening for the first time since they'd gotten in the car. I know, Kyle, and I'm going to help you do that. But you need to understand something. The people after you won't stop. They have resources. They have power. And they'll do anything to silence you. Kyle exhaled sharply, trying to wrap his head around the enormity of the situation. So what do I do? Where do we go from here? Sam's gaze remained fixed on the road. We lay low for now. Get somewhere safe. Then, we figure out how to expose them. Kyle nodded, feeling a small sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was something. At least Sam wasn't abandoning him like everyone else in his life seemed to have done. They continued down the winding streets, the lights of the city fading as they drove further away from the chaos. Kyle wasn't sure how long they had been driving, but the quiet stretch of road ahead seemed like a temporary escape, a brief moment of calm before the storm hit again. Just as Kyle thought they might have reached some kind of temporary safety, Sam's phone buzzed, breaking the silence. He glanced at the screen for a moment before letting out a sharp curse. What's wrong? Kyle asked, his heart pounding again. Sam didn't answer immediately. He was reading the message on his phone, his face darkening. After a moment, he set the phone down on the dashboard and spoke, his voice heavy with urgency. They found us, Sam said, his words sending a chill down Kyle's spine. Kyle's blood ran cold. What do you mean they found us? How could they? Sam's eyes flickered briefly to Kyle, then back to the road. They've been tracking us. Somehow, they knew we were heading out here. And now, they're closing in. We need to get off the road. Where are we going? Kyle asked, panic creeping into his voice. Hold on, Sam replied, his voice tight. This is going to get rough. Without warning, Sam jerked the wheel to the side, veering onto a narrow dirt road. The car bounced wildly as it sped down the uneven path, the tires screeching against the gravel. Kyle's heart raced as the trees around them blurred in a rush of green. He had no idea where they were going or what Sam had in mind, but he had no choice but to trust him. Suddenly, a series of headlights appeared behind them, growing brighter with every passing second. The masked men had found them. Sam pushed the pedal to the floor, and the car shot forward, but the headlights didn't fade. They were gaining on them, and the gap was closing fast. Kyle's breath caught in his throat as Sam made another sharp turn, sending the car skidding on the gravel. The car swerved dangerously, and for a brief moment, it felt like they were going to crash. Kyle gripped the door, his knuckles white. They're too close. Kyle shouted. What do we do? Sam didn't answer, but Kyle could see the determination in his eyes. He wasn't going to let them catch up. But even Kyle could tell there was nowhere left to run. The chase was on, and it seemed like it would only end one way. But how would it end? Would Kyle find the truth, or would he become just another casualty in the dangerous game that had been thrust upon him? The question loomed, but for now, all they could do was outrun their pursuers and hope it wasn't too late. The car roared down the narrow, bumpy dirt road, its tires kicking up dust and rocks as Sam swerved sharply, trying to evade the headlights of the vehicle chasing them. The sound of the pursuing car grew louder, and Kyle could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, his mind racing faster than the car itself. There was no escape. The masked men were getting closer with every passing second. Sam, they're almost on us, Kyle shouted, his voice strained with fear. I know, Sam growled, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. But I can't lose them on this road. Hold on tight. We're making a turn up ahead. The trees around them blurred into dark streaks of green and brown. The dim headlights from behind seemed like a constant reminder that they were being hunted. The path ahead of them was treacherous, but Sam wasn't slowing down. It was clear that they were running out of options, and Sam was determined to outdrive their pursuers no matter the cost. Up ahead, the The road curved sharply, leading to a steep incline. Sam's eyes flickered briefly to the rearview mirror, then back to the road. The headlights were dangerously close now, only a few yards behind them. Sam slammed his foot on the brake, jerking the car to the left just as they reached the curve. The car skidded, the tires screaming in protest as it slid sideways, barely managing to stay on course. Kyle's heart skipped a beat as the edge of the road seemed to vanish into nothingness, a sheer drop on one side. "Sam," Kyle gasped, gripping the seat as tightly as he could. "This is insane. What are you doing?" Sam didn't answer. His jaw was clenched tight, his eyes fixed ahead as they continued to race up the incline. The headlights of the pursuing car reflected off the rearview mirror, too close for comfort. As they crested the hill, Sam twisted the wheel once again, sending the car barreling down a narrow path that cut through the trees. This was no longer a road. It was an off-road trail, barely wide enough for the car to fit through, let alone outrun the people behind them. Kyle's breath caught in his throat. There was no way they could outrun them now. He could hear the pursuing car's engine growling closer, its tires skimming the loose gravel. But just as Kyle was about to lose hope, he saw something in the distance. A large, abandoned building, its outline barely visible in the dim light of the night. It looked like some sort of warehouse or old factory. Sam's eyes locked onto it, and without saying a word, he slammed the car into the dirt and aimed straight for the building. "We're going in there," Sam yelled, his voice filled with urgency. Before Kyle could protest, the car was careening toward the building at breakneck speed. He could see the entrance, a large, rusted metal door, coming closer. The headlights behind them were still growing, but Sam was determined to get them inside before it was too late. With a final burst of speed, Sam yanked the wheel hard to the right, sending the car into a sharp turn just as they reached the entrance. The tires screeched, the car fishtailing slightly before they slid through the open door. The building was dark, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The car bounced over broken concrete floors, and the sound of the pursuing car's engine faded behind them, at least for the moment. Sam didn't slow down, though. He kept the foot on the gas pedal, steering the car deeper into the darkened warehouse. The headlights from the pursuing vehicle cut through the open entrance, briefly illuminating the building's interior before the car screeched to a halt, and the headlights were cut off entirely. They had lost them, at least for now. Sam let out a sharp breath, his shoulders tense as he shifted the car into park. The engine hummed to a stop, and for a moment, the world was silent again. Kyle sat in the passenger seat, his hands still gripping the door, his chest heaving as he tried to calm his racing heart. He looked at Sam, who was now exhaling deeply, the strain of the chase still visible on his face. "That was way too close," Kyle said, his voice shaky. Sam didn't answer immediately. He just sat there, eyes fixed on the dark shadows outside the car. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing. The danger wasn't over, but they had bought themselves some time. "We're safe for now," Sam said finally, his voice quieter than before. "But we can't stay here long. They'll know where we are soon enough." Kyle looked around the warehouse. The place was desolate, filled with broken machinery and old crates, the windows boarded up and the walls covered in grime. It looked abandoned, forgotten, a perfect hiding place for now. "We need to figure out what's going on," Kyle said, still trying to wrap his mind around the whirlwind of events. "Who are those people? And why are they after me?" Sam sighed, leaning back in his seat. "You've seen enough to know what's at stake. There's no going back now. We're caught in the middle of something much bigger than us. Those people chasing us? They're part of a secret organization, a group with power and resources. They've been controlling things for a long time." Kyle's confusion deepened. "What do you mean controlling things? What are they trying to hide? What do they want with me?" Sam glanced at him, his eyes dark with worry. "You're not just an innocent bystander in all of this, Kyle. You have something they need. That confession you have? It's not just a random piece of evidence. It's a key to something that could expose them for everything they've done. But they can't afford to let the truth get out. Not now." Kyle's heart sank. He had suspected that the confession was more than it appeared, but hearing it confirmed sent a wave of dread through him. "So, they'll stop at nothing to get it back?" Sam nodded grimly. Exactly. And that's why we can't waste any time. We need to get that confession to the right people, people who can protect you. But we can't do it alone. Kyle's stomach churned. Who are the right people? Sam met his gaze. People who know how to fight against them. People who have been trying to expose the truth for years. But first, we need to get you somewhere safe. The sound of tires squealing outside broke the tension, and Kyle's heart skipped a beat. His breath caught in his throat as he turned toward the door of the warehouse, a deep sense of dread creeping over him. They weren't safe. Not yet. The chase wasn't over, and the danger was far from finished. Sam, they're here, Kyle said, his voice barely a whisper. Sam's expression turned hard, his jaw tightening. We need to move. Now. The door behind them creaked open, and the shadows seemed to close in on them. The hunt was on once again. The door to the warehouse creaked ominously as a cold draft swept in, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Sam's hand shot to the dashboard, fingers hovering over the ignition. His eyes darted to Kyle, who was tense, his body frozen in place. Get down, Sam hissed. Kyle didn't need to be told twice. He ducked instinctively, his back pressing against the cold leather seat, his heart thumping so loudly he was sure it could be heard from outside the car. The footsteps grew louder, each step deliberate and measured, as if the people outside knew exactly where they were, knew exactly what they wanted. From the darkness outside, there was a low, rumbling voice that made Kyle's blood run cold. They're here. I can feel it. Kyle's breath caught in his throat. Sam's grip on the steering wheel tightened as the door creaked again, a sharp sound that echoed in the empty warehouse. The tension was unbearable, every second feeling like an eternity. They're coming, Sam muttered, his voice low but urgent. We need to move, Kyle. Now. Before Kyle could even think about what was happening, Sam turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life, breaking the silence with its power. But the car was parked too far into the warehouse to simply drive straight out. They were cornered. The shadows outside grew closer, their outlines shifting as they moved toward the entrance. Sam floored the gas pedal, the car lurching forward. It was a risky move, but Sam had no choice. They needed to escape now. Sam swung the wheel hard to the right, sending the car into a sharp, sliding turn. The tires screeched, skidding on the dusty concrete floor. The car jerked, barely missing a stack of old crates that could have destroyed the vehicle. But the real danger wasn't the crates, it was the people outside. Kyle felt the cold sweat break out on his brow as the car careened toward the back exit of the warehouse. They were almost there. They just needed to make it through that narrow alleyway outside. The headlights from their pursuers flashed through the entrance like a lighthouse in the dark, and just as Sam made the final turn, the sound of an engine revving echoed through the warehouse. They're right behind us, Kyle shouted, his pulse racing. Sam didn't respond. He focused all his energy on getting the car through the narrow opening. His knuckles were white as he gripped the wheel, the tension in his jaw evident. The headlights from the other car illuminated the space around them, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. With a final lurch, Sam slammed the car through the exit, the tires screeching as they hit the dirt path outside. The pursuing car followed, but it wasn't as nimble as Sam's. It struggled to make the sharp turn, and as Sam accelerated, the headlights of the enemy vehicle grew dimmer and dimmer. But just as they thought they were in the clear, Sam slammed on the brakes. The car jerked forward and skidded to a stop just as another vehicle, a black SUV, came into view, blocking their path. Out, Sam ordered, his voice steady but with an edge of desperation. Before Kyle could react, Sam was already out of the car, moving quickly toward the SUV, his movements sharp and controlled. Kyle hesitated for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were trapped again. The SUV's headlights blinded Kyle as he quickly exited the car, following Sam's lead. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline and dust, the night unusually quiet except for the sound of their hurried footsteps. Where are we going? Kyle asked, trying to catch his breath. Follow me, Sam muttered, not looking back. We need to get to a place where they can't track us. They moved swiftly, their footsteps echoing off the empty streets, the sound of engines revving behind them. It was clear that whoever these people were, they were relentless. Sam had already led Kyle to a small alley, one that was hidden from view, surrounded by tall buildings that blocked the line of sight from the road. They were trying to buy themselves time. As they moved deeper into the shadows, Kyle could hear the sounds of the SUVs pulling up nearby. The men chasing them had gotten out, their footsteps echoing as they spread out, trying to track them down. Sam grabbed Kyle's arm and pulled him into a dark doorway, where they crouched low, breathing quietly. Kyle's heart was still pounding, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Every moment felt like a countdown to disaster. From their position, they could see the flashlights of their pursuers sweeping the alleyway, the beams of light cutting through the darkness. Sam held his breath, waiting, his body tense. Kyle mirrored his actions, barely making a sound. The minutes dragged on, but it felt like hours. The only sound was the soft rustle of the night breeze and the distant hum of traffic. The enemy hadn't found them yet, but it was only a matter of time. "They're getting closer," Kyle whispered, his voice tight with fear. "What do we do now?" "We wait," Sam answered, his voice low and steady. "We can't risk them hearing us. If we move too soon, we're done." Kyle nodded, his body trembling. This wasn't just a chase anymore. It was a battle for survival. They weren't just running from a crime. They were running from an entire network of people who had the power to destroy them. Minutes passed in silence, each one stretching longer than the last. Kyle's mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. Who were these people? What did they want from him? And how had his life gone from being accused of a crime he didn't commit to being on the run from a dangerous conspiracy? Suddenly, a voice broke the stillness, low and menacing. "Where are they?" Kyle's blood ran cold. The voice was close, too close. Sam's grip tightened on his arm, pulling him even deeper into the shadows. They were cornered. There was no escape without a fight. But Sam wasn't panicking. His eyes met Kyle's, and for the first time in hours, Kyle saw a flicker of calm in the storm. Sam had a plan. He had to. Then, without a word, Sam stepped forward, drawing something from his coat. A gun. He looked at Kyle, his expression unreadable. "We're going to fight our way out of this," Sam said quietly. Kyle's pulse raced. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't even sure if he could handle what was coming next. But he didn't have a choice. They were running out of options, and this was the only one left. As the sound of footsteps grew louder, Kyle's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't the life he had imagined, but it was the life he had now. And whatever happened next, he had to survive. Because the truth was still out there. And no matter what, Kyle wasn't going to stop until he found it. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Kyle's heart thundered in his chest as he and Sam pressed themselves against the wall, barely breathing, barely moving. Sam held the gun firmly in his hands, his knuckles white, eyes fixed on the narrow alley ahead. The threat was real, and every passing second felt like a countdown. "You ready?" Sam whispered, his voice barely audible. Kyle nodded, though his stomach was in knots. He had never imagined he'd be in a situation like this. His life, once simple, had been turned upside down, and now he was a fugitive running from dangerous men with no idea what they wanted or how far they would go to get it. But one thing was certain. Sam wasn't just protecting him. He was fighting for something bigger than himself. And that made Kyle realize he had no choice but to keep moving forward, even if it scared him to death. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, the alley was eerily quiet. Sam's eyes flicked toward Kyle, and he nodded toward the corner ahead. Kyle's pulse quickened. The time to make a move had come. Sam stepped out from the shadows, gun raised, his eyes scanning the alley with military precision. Kyle hesitated for only a fraction of a second before following him. They crept forward, their steps soundless, blending with the night. Every sound, every movement felt amplified in the tense silence. Then, a voice broke through the stillness. "There they are." The shout came from behind them, from the other side of the alley. The flashlights flared to life, sweeping the darkness. There were at least 3 men, their figures tall and imposing in the dim light. "Shit," Sam muttered under his breath, and before Kyle could react, Sam had already raised his gun, firing off a shot into the air. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the alley, sharp and shocking. The pursuers flinched and ducked for cover. Run! Sam barked, pulling Kyle forward as he sprinted toward a side exit of the alley. The men were recovering quickly, yelling at each other to regroup. Kyle's feet hit the ground running, his lungs burning with every step. The narrow alley stretched out in front of them, but there was no real cover, no real place to hide. His mind raced, trying to think of a plan, trying to figure out how they were going to escape. Every moment counted. They couldn't afford to waste time. They reached the end of the alley, and Sam veered left, pulling Kyle behind a large dumpster. They crouched low, trying to catch their breath, hearts still pounding. Sam peered around the corner, his gun at the ready. "They're getting closer," Sam muttered, eyes narrowing as he tracked the movement of the men in the distance. "We need to keep moving. We can't let them get us cornered." Kyle nodded, his mind still spinning. There was no time to think about what would happen next. The only thing that mattered was survival and getting away. The truth was still out there, but it felt as if it was slipping through his fingers with every second that passed. Sam's eyes flicked over to Kyle, his expression dark. "Listen to me, Kyle. We're not safe here. We need to go off the grid. I know a place, a safe house, where they can't find us. But we have to move now." "Where?" Kyle gasped, still winded from running. He didn't care where they were going as long as it was somewhere they could catch their breath. Sam didn't hesitate. "Follow me." Without another word, Sam led the way, darting into a narrow side street. The headlights from the pursuing cars flickered, but Sam moved quickly, expertly dodging into the shadows. The night was their only ally now. They weren't just being chased, they were being hunted. As they rounded a corner, Kyle glanced back, catching a glimpse of the black SUV that had been tailing them. Its headlights were now a distant glow, but it wasn't the end of the chase. They had to get further away. They had to disappear. Sam kept moving with purpose, his eyes scanning the area. Kyle followed closely, adrenaline pushing him forward. He wasn't sure how long they ran, maybe minutes, maybe hours, but it felt like an eternity. His legs were on fire, his breath ragged, but Sam never slowed. The man was determined, and Kyle realized that they weren't just running from people who wanted to hurt them. They were running from a system that had been set up to cover its own tracks, no matter the cost. They stopped abruptly at an old, rusted door hidden between two buildings. Sam glanced over his shoulder before pulling out a set of keys from his pocket. He unlocked the door with quick, practiced movements. "This is it," Sam said, his voice low. "Inside. Hurry." Kyle stepped inside first, then Sam followed, locking the door behind them. The interior of the building was dimly lit, the air thick with dust and the smell of old paper. It looked abandoned, just like the warehouse, but with a strange, cold emptiness to it. Sam moved to the back of the room, where a desk sat cluttered with papers and old equipment. Kyle took a hesitant step forward, his eyes darting around, trying to make sense of their new surroundings. "This place is safe," Sam said, noticing Kyle's unease. "No one knows about it. We'll lay low here for now, regroup, and figure out what comes next." Kyle's mind was still racing. The danger wasn't over, not by a long shot. The men chasing them were relentless, and now they had to figure out how to take the fight back to them. But Sam had said something important. They weren't just running. They were fighting for something bigger. Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening, whatever this conspiracy was, it wasn't just about his name anymore. It was about exposing the truth, about taking down a system that had hidden its secrets for far too long. "We're not safe yet, though," Kyle said, breaking the silence. "What happens now? What do we do about the confession? Who do we trust?" Sam turned to face him, his expression grim. "We get the confession to the right people, people who can protect it, and you. We'll have to be careful. We can't trust anyone easily, Kyle." "Not anymore." Kyle nodded, swallowing hard. He didn't know who these right people were, but he was beginning to understand that he couldn't do this alone. He was in too deep now. As the night stretched on, Kyle and Sam settled into their temporary refuge. But even in the safety of this hidden room, Kyle couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that the danger was still out there, still closing in. And deep down, Kyle knew that their next move could change everything. But would it be enough to finally expose the truth? Would they be able to bring down the powerful forces chasing them? Or would they become just another casualty in a fight they couldn't win? Only time would tell. And for Kyle, time was running out. The silence in the room was deafening, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the old building. Kyle sat on a dusty chair in the corner, his mind racing as he tried to process everything that had happened. His body ached from the sprint, his heart still pounding in his chest from the chase. But it was the questions that kept him awake. Who were these people chasing him? Why had they gone to such lengths to silence him? And what did this confession, this damning piece of evidence, really mean? Across the room, Sam was hunched over the desk, sifting through a stack of papers. His brow furrowed in concentration, but there was an air of exhaustion about him too. He hadn't slept in hours. Neither had Kyle. For the first time, Kyle allowed himself to relax, if only for a moment. It was strange, but he couldn't remember the last time he felt this on edge. He should have been relieved to be in this hideout, away from the danger, but all he felt was more uncertainty. Sam stopped rummaging through the papers, finally looking up at Kyle. "We need to talk," Sam said quietly, his voice tinged with something more serious than usual. Kyle straightened in his chair. "Talk about what? What comes next? The longer we wait, the closer they get. We need to act fast. But I can't figure out who to trust." Sam's expression darkened. "That's the problem, Kyle. You're not just running from these people. There's someone much bigger behind all of this. Someone with a lot more power than we ever expected." Kyle felt a pit form in his stomach. "Who are you talking about? Who's pulling the strings here?" Sam didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned back to the papers on the desk. With slow, deliberate movements, he pushed aside the clutter, revealing a folder, its edges worn and stained. Sam picked it up and walked over to Kyle, setting it in front of him. "This," Sam said quietly, "is the key to everything." Kyle's eyes locked on the folder. He had no idea what was inside, but something told him that whatever it was, it would change everything. He reached for it, his fingers trembling slightly, and flipped it open. Inside was a collection of documents, photographs, and various notes. Kyle scanned the first page, reading the words, his heart sinking as the truth began to unfurl before him. There were names that Kyle recognized, names that shocked him, people he'd seen on the news, powerful people. But it was the next line that sent a cold wave through him. Project Ascendant, classified intelligence operation. The words burned into his mind. Project Ascendant? What was this? Sam leaned forward, his voice lowering. Project Ascendant is the reason you're in this mess. It's an operation, a deep-cover intelligence network that's been manipulating events, controlling outcomes, and erasing evidence for years. And those people you've been running from? They're part of it. They work for a shadow faction of the government, a faction that wants to keep the truth buried. Kyle looked up at Sam, his mind reeling. "Are you saying this whole thing was a setup? That they've been framing me from the start?" Sam nodded slowly. "Yes, you were targeted, Kyle. From the moment they found out you had that confession, they knew you could be the one to expose them. That's why they framed you for that crime. It wasn't just about ruining your life. It was about keeping the truth locked away, no matter the cost." Kyle felt his breath catch in his throat. He was shaking now, unable to process the magnitude of what Sam was telling him. These weren't just random criminals or petty criminals he was dealing with. They were part of something far larger. "Then how do we stop them?" Kyle asked, his voice trembling. "How do we take them down?" Sam's gaze hardened. "We need to hit them where it hurts. We expose their operation. We leak the documents, the evidence. We get the truth out there. But it won't be easy. They have resources. They have people everywhere. And they'll do anything to stop us." Kyle stared at the papers again, his mind racing. The weight of it all was suffocating. How could one person, no matter how determined, take down an entire operation like this? The odds seemed impossible. But Sam was right. The truth was the key. And if they didn't expose it, they would be hunted for the rest of their lives. "What's the next step?" Kyle asked, his voice now steady. His fear had transformed into resolve. This wasn't just about saving himself anymore. It was about taking down the people who thought they could control everything. Sam's lips pressed into a thin line. "We need to get the documents to someone who can get it to the media. We can't trust anyone we know, Kyle. Not even the police." They're part of it. But there are people who've been trying to expose them for years. We need to get to them. Kyle nodded, though a feeling of dread crept up on him. Who were these people they could trust? It seemed like every turn they made only led them deeper into a web of deception. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps broke the silence. Heavy, deliberate, moving toward the door. Kyle's heart skipped a beat. Were they found already? Sam stiffened. Get down now. Without thinking, Kyle dropped to the floor, his breath catching in his throat. Sam was already moving toward the back of the room, pulling open a closet door and gesturing for Kyle to follow. They needed to hide, to move quickly. Whoever was outside the door wasn't a friend. Kyle scrambled into the closet, crouching low and silent. Sam slid in beside him, the door clicking shut behind them. The only sounds were their ragged breathing and the distant creak of the building. Every inch of Kyle's body screamed with tension. The footsteps outside stopped. There was a brief pause. Then, a voice, deep, steady, and unmistakable, spoke from just outside the door. "We know you're in there, Sam," the voice said, calm but laced with menace. "It's over. Come out." Kyle's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. It was the same voice of the man who had chased them in the warehouse, the one who had ordered them to drop the papers. "Sam," Kyle whispered, his voice tight with fear. "What now?" Sam didn't reply immediately. He seemed to be calculating his next move, his hand resting on the gun in his jacket. His eyes met Kyle's, and for a moment, there was a quiet understanding between them. The moment of truth had arrived. They had no choice but to face the people who had been hunting them. Kyle didn't know if they would survive this, or if they would even make it out alive. But he knew one thing for sure. They weren't going down without a fight. Sam took a deep breath and slowly stood up, motioning for Kyle to follow his lead. The door creaked open. The final showdown was about to begin. The door creaked open with a slow, deliberate motion, the sound echoing in the silence of the room. Kyle's pulse hammered in his ears, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Sam, standing tall, motioned for Kyle to stay low and quiet, his expression unreadable, his fingers still lightly gripping the gun at his side. The man in the doorway was tall, wearing a dark, well-tailored suit. His face was partially obscured by shadows, but Kyle could see enough to recognize the calculating, cold look in his eyes. This was no ordinary henchman. This man was someone with power, someone who knew how to play the game of control. "Sam," the man said, his voice deep and calm, betraying no emotion. "You've caused quite the mess. It's time to end this." Sam's jaw tightened. "You won't get away with it. Not this time." The man smirked, leaning against the doorframe. "I don't think you understand, Sam. This isn't just about you or your little friend here." He paused, his gaze flickering over to Kyle for a moment, then back to Sam. "This is bigger than both of you." Kyle's throat went dry. What did this man mean by bigger? He knew they were involved in something far-reaching, but hearing it from the enemy made the truth feel all the more chilling. "We have the confession," Sam said, his voice steady despite the threat in the room. "You can't erase the truth." The man laughed, a dark, hollow sound. "The truth? Sam, do you really think this is about truth? This is about power. And the moment you decided to dig into something you didn't understand, you sealed your fate." Kyle's mind raced. There it was again, power. The one thing that had driven everything they'd been through. Power had been the reason they'd been targeted, the reason the conspiracy had gone unnoticed for so long. Power had made them pawns in someone else's game. But Sam wasn't backing down. Kyle could see the fire in his eyes. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something more, justice. "We're not afraid of you," Sam said, his voice sharp. "You can kill us, but it won't stop what we've started. The truth will come out. You know that." The man's smile faded, his expression hardening. "You think you can outsmart us? Think again." He stepped forward, his footsteps slow and heavy. Kyle felt a wave of panic rise in his chest. They had nowhere to run. No more tricks. No more hiding. But just as the man moved closer, there was a loud, deafening crash from outside the building. The sound of glass shattering and a vehicle screeching to a halt made everyone freeze. The man's eyes widened for the briefest moment, And in that instant, Sam acted. He lunged forward, taking the man by surprise, and before the man could react, Sam had him in a chokehold. The gun Sam had been holding pressed against the man's side, making him freeze in place. Kyle's heart raced. The sudden chaos was their chance, their opening to do something, anything to end this nightmare. He had no idea what Sam planned, but for the first time in a long while, Kyle felt a spark of hope. "Call it off," Sam growled, his voice filled with fury. "Tell your people to stop hunting us." The man struggled, trying to free himself, but Sam held him firm, his grip like iron. "You're not in control anymore," Sam continued. "You may have power, but it's over. You lost." A distant noise, shouting, movement, came from outside, and for a split second, the man's eyes flickered with realization. He knew reinforcements were coming, but Sam was not about to let that happen. "You don't know what you're dealing with," the man said through gritted teeth. "No," Sam responded, his voice colder than ever. "But you'll know what happens when you mess with the wrong people." Suddenly, there was another noise, louder this time, and before Kyle could even react, the walls of the building seemed to shake. The sound of a vehicle crashing through the front of the warehouse sent debris flying in every direction. And then, from the smoke and dust, two figures emerged, two people who had arrived just in time to change everything. "Sam, you all right?" A woman's voice called out from the debris. Sam turned, his grip loosening on the man in front of him as he saw who had arrived. Anna.
Mac.
Anna and Max, both armed and determined, stepped forward, their eyes scanning the room for threats. They were part of the network Sam had been working with, a group of people who had been trying to expose the conspiracy for years. "The right people." Anna nodded toward Kyle. "We got the message. Time to end this." The man in Sam's grip struggled one last time, but then, in a flash, he was subdued by Max. "We've got you," Max said, his voice calm but filled with authority. Kyle watched as the scene unfolded, his mind trying to catch up with what was happening. These were the people Sam had been working with, the people who had been watching, waiting for their chance. They were the ones who could take the documents, the confession, and expose the entire operation. The man who had been leading the pursuit was now restrained and on his knees, defeated. The fight was over, but the battle for the truth was only just beginning. "Take him," Anna ordered. "We'll handle the rest." With a final glance at Sam and Kyle, Anna and Max moved swiftly, securing the man and preparing to leave. But before they could, Sam turned to Kyle, a look of exhaustion and relief on his face. "You did good, Kyle," Sam said, his voice steady now. "You kept pushing, even when it seemed impossible." Kyle swallowed hard, his emotions a tangled mess. "I didn't do it alone. You saved me." Sam shook his head. "You saved yourself. I just helped you find the way." Kyle looked down at the papers in his hand. The confession, the proof of everything that had been hidden. The truth. It was finally in the right hands. As Anna and Max led the restrained man out of the building, Sam turned to Kyle one last time. "It's over now. You can finally live the life you deserve." Kyle nodded slowly, a sense of calm finally washing over him. The fight, the chase, the terror, it was all behind him now. The truth was out, and the conspiracy was falling apart. But there was something else, something deeper. The realization that no matter how powerful the forces against them had been, in the end, it was the pursuit of truth that had won. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The sun was just beginning to rise on the horizon, the first light of morning breaking through the darkness. Kyle looked up, a new sense of hope in his chest. The end of one chapter was just the beginning of another.